Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Tetzaveh, and we're some words of introduction are in order. The Zera Shimshon is going to talk about the olive oil production industry, the ancient olive oil production industry. And for our purposes, besides for looking at a couple of psukim in a moment, we first need to just talk about a basic fact of producing olive oil, and that is that you have two competing goals when you make olive oil. On the one hand, one goal is to get as much of the olive oil out of the olives as you can. So if you're all right, and that makes perfect sense. The same way if you have an orange crop or an apple crop and you want to make orange juice or apple, you want to get as much of the orange juice or as much as the apple juice as you can out of the fruit. Well, the same thing is certainly true of olives. However, on the other side of the equation, you have the fact that the more damage you do to the olive, the more you crush it and grind it, the more chance there is of having sediment and actual pieces of the olive or particles of olive mixed in with the oil. And so we're going to see that there's kind of a tension between those two things. Suffice it to say, for our purposes, that in ancient times, they used to, as a step one, to get the finest olive oil with the least amount of sediment and the least amount of any kind of pieces or tiny particles of olive, they would press on the olive or crush the olive only a little bit, enough to get the olive juice, the olive oil flowing out. And that was considered their grade A, their top quality oil. And then later on, once they were at the point when they had extracted that top level oil, and they just wanted to get out as much of the remaining olive oil as they could, they would actually grind up the olives with millstones and grind them to a pulp, literally, and then have the olive oil ooze out, and then try and strain out all of the pieces of the olives and just be left with the oil. And that was considered an inferior oil. That was, let's call that a grade B oil. There were other methods that they could use as well in between those two extremes, but those are basically the two extremes that we're going to hear about in the Zera Shimshon tonight. So now, once we understand that, let's take a look at two psukim. The first pasuk is actually conveniently the first pasuk in our parsha of Parshas Tetzaveh, Perek Chav Zayin pasuk Chav, and it reads as follows: Ve'ata Tetzaveh es bnei Yisrael, and you should command bnei Yisrael, v'yikhu elecha, and they should take to you. This is Hashem, of course, talking to Moshe. They should take to you shemen zayis zoch, pure olive oil, kosis lamaor, and it should be from the crushing or the pressing of the olives, lamaor, for illumination, meaning for lighting the menorah, lahalos ner tamid, to cause to rise up the ner tamid, a candle tamid all of the time. That's the first pasuk. Now let's look at a pasuk a little bit later in our parsha, still in Parshas Tetzaveh. And this pasuk is Perek Chav Tes, pasuk Mem. And here we are no longer talking about the menorah. We're talking about another thing that required olive oil. And this is the olive oil that was used in the Korban Mincha, the meal offering. A meal offering, there were lots of different types of meal offerings. Here we're talking about the Korban Mincha, the meal offering that was brought with the daily Korban Olah, and the Torah says as follows: the isaron soles, and you should bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour, bolul b'shemen kosis, and it should be mixed with shemen, that is kosis, that comes from olives which are crushed. That's the same word that we saw in the previous pasuk. Reva hahin, and it should the quantity of olive oil is 1/4 of a hin. The nesech, and the wine libation that came along with this Korban Olah, revius ahin yoyin, was 1/4 of a hin of wine. A hin was a Torah measurement. La keves ha'echad, for one keves. And so for our purposes, the yayin nesech is not what concerns us, nor does the Korban Tamid, the Olah, doesn't concern us. What concerns us is simply the first few words of the pasuk, that they would take fine flour and they would mix it with shemen kosis. They would mix it with oil that came from pressing or crushing the olives. Okay, so let's take a look now. Let's turn our attention now to the Zera Shimshon and see what he has to say. Pasuk, in the pasuk, and this is the first pasuk we looked at, kosis lamaor. The Torah says that when you light the menorah, you should use oil that comes from pressing or crushing the olives. Perish Rashi, Rashi explained, hazesim, the olives, kosesh b'machteshes, they are crushed in a mortar, v'chule, etc. What the Zera Shimshon leaves out here is extremely important, but he just says v'chule because he wants us to look at the Rashi inside. But let me explain what Rashi says. Let me share that with you. Rashi says that when you take the olives and you press them in a mortar, that will extract the top quality oil, that we're going to call it the grade A oil, the Sug Rishon or Sug Aleph oil. And that's when you just put the first pressure, the first pressing on the olive, that's the olive oil that comes out with the least chance of getting any of the pieces of the olive or the particles or the sediment from the olives itself. Then you take those same olives after you've extracted that type, quality A oil, and you crush them in millstones, as we talked about, and you totally crush up the olives. And now you have good usable olive oil, but that's Sug Bet, Sug Sheni. That's the second level of quality, the grade B oil, as the Zera Shimshon continues. The Hasheni, and the second level of quality oil, Pasal lemenorah. It may not be used for the menorah. Only grade A olive oil can be used for menorah. Grade B olive oil, after the actual grinding of the olives with the millstones, it cannot be used for the menorah. The kosher lemenachos, but it is okay. It is fit to be used as the olive oil for meal offerings. Shenemar, as our pasuk says, kosis lamaor. The olive oil that comes from just crushing the olives as opposed to grinding them, that's the grade A oil, is used lamaor, is used for lighting the menorah. The low kosis, and we're not saying that you can only be limited to this grade A oil, lemenachos, for the meal offering. So it's based on a drasha of the pasuk that Rashi brings down, that the pasuk is telling us you must limit yourself to grade A oil for the menorah, but you need not limit yourself to the grade A oil. You can even use the grade B oil, again, that comes from grinding the olives. You can use that for menachos, for the meal offerings. Ulakaman gabe menachos, and later on in the pasuk was the second pasuk we looked at that was talking about korban mincha, the meal offering, Pirish Rashi. Rashi explained, al pasuk v'isaran soles bolul b'shem and kosis, when the Torah said, you bring a tenth of fine flour and you mix it with shemen kosis, olive oil from pressing or crushing the olives. Said, lo ne'amar kosis lechova ela lahachshir. Here, regarding the meal offerings, the Torah did not use the word kosis to obligate you to restrict yourself, to limit yourself to only using grade A oil, but rather lahachshir, to make sure you understand that it is kosher, that it's fit and appropriate to use the grade A oil, not only for the menorah, but also for the menachos, the meal offerings, the korban mincha. Lefi shenemar kosis lamaor, because the Torah here in our first pasuk in starting Tetzaveh said you should use kosis oil, the finest oil, the grade A oil for illumination. Yochol lefoslo lemenachos. I might have thought that what the Torah was indicating was only use such fine oil for menorah. Do not use this fine grade A oil for your meal offerings. Talmud Lomar Khan. So the Torah comes to teach us here, meaning in the later pasuk, the second pasuk that we read, that was discussing the meal offerings. Talmud Lomar, the Torah teaches us Khan kosis. That it's talking about the grade A oil. Lilame, to teach us the kosis nami kosher, that this grade A oil is also fit and appropriate for the menachos. not just for the menorah, but it can also be used for meal offerings. V'lo ne'amar kosis la'ma'or, and the Torah did not say the fine oil should be used for lighting the menorah, ela l'mayet menachos, except to exclude the meal offering she'ein tzarich kosis, that they do not need to be limited to the grade A oil. Ad kan Lashono, until here is a quote from Rashi. So it's certainly, if you want to really get an accurate picture of Rashi, it's a good idea to look at the two Rashis, one on the first pasuk we looked at talking about the menorah, and one at the later pasuk that we looked at talking about discussing the meal offerings. But for our purposes, it should be clear in this first paragraph that the Zera Shimshon has brought in the two psukim and the two Rashis to teach us a very basic idea, very basic halacha, you might say, and that is that there are two, as we said in the beginning, two types of ways of getting out olive oil, at least two types of ways, but of the two we're talking about, there's a grade A olive oil that comes out at first, and then there's a grade B oil that comes out when you actually grind up the olives. The menorah, for lighting the menorah, for the purpose of lighting the menorah, we can only use grade A, and that's what the Torah says, kosis la'ma'or. And then for the menachos, for the meal offerings, we can use grade A. However, we can also use grade B, the inferior olive oil that comes out after grinding up the olives. That's also okay for menachos. So either quality of oil can be used for menachos, only the best oil, olive oil, for lighting the menorah. That's where we are so far in the Rashi. That's what the Zera Shimshon has brought down. Let's move to the next paragraph. Makshim, the commentators on Rashi ask, "De lo lichtov kra lo hey velo vav." Here, the Zera Shimshon is using an expression about hey and vav, and what he's saying is that the Meforshim, when Rashi asked, according to Rashi, why didn't the Torah leave out both the letter hey and the letter vav, meaning leave out both the extra word in the first pasuk and the extra word in the second pasuk? Not that there's a hey and a vav, we're not dealing with a hey and a vav, but as the expression goes, leave out both the hey and the vav, and then you won't have any problem, meaning leave out one extra word from the first pasuk, leave out an extra word from the second pasuk, and you won't have any questions, you won't have any problems to deal with in terms of figuring out what the extra words are doing there. And the Zera Shimshon is going to explain. Lo lichtov kosis b'menachos, let the Torah not write the word kosis, which again is a reference to that first pressing of the olives that gets out the best oil. Let them not use that word regarding meal offerings. V'lo lichtov la'ma'or, and let the Torah not write the word for illumination b'menorah, regarding the menorah. Meaning that according to Rashi's explanation, the Meforshim and Rashi feel that those two words, instead of the Torah putting in both words and creating problems that Rashi had to figure out, let the Torah leave out, omit both words, and then there'd be no problems and everything would be clear. That's question number one. The Od Kasha, and another question, the Minole Rashi. From where did Rashi know? Lemelaf, to learn, Hocha, here, Mikosis Lamaor, from the words crushing the olives to make an oil for lighting, shehasheni kosher lemenachos, that the inferior oil, the grade B oil, is okay to be used for menachos. How did Rashi know that? Dilma, perhaps b'menachos kosis hu delo ba'inon. Perhaps all the Torah is teaching us is that we are not required to use the finest grade A oil for the meal offerings. Aval, but in hachinami, maybe we're supposed to concede shehasheni nami lechude aser, that the grade B oil also by itself is forbidden to use for the menachos. Meaning, perhaps we can learn from the psukim differently than Rashi and say that we're not required to use grade A oil for menachos, but we're also not allowed to use the grade B oil if it's by itself for the menachos, for the meal offerings. What does that mean? Zera Shimshon continues. De lo hichshira haTorah b'menachos, because perhaps the Torah only allowed us for meal offerings to use ela kishetochnan biyachad, when you grind up the olives and it has both its best oil and its lower level oil together inside of it. U'ma'urav hashemen harishon im hasheni, the grade A oil and the grade B oil are both still in the olive. Maybe that's what the Torah permitted. Aval kishikvar nital min azayis, Hashem and Harishon. But if you take out, you press the olives and you take out the highest quality, the grade A oil, and you leave it inside of the olive, remaining only the grade B oil, perhaps that's not good. Hanishar mimenu lo yihiyeh kosher lemenachos. Perhaps what's left in the olive, since it's only the grade B olive, with a grade B oil, would not be kosher for menachos. So now let's pause to understand the second question that the Zera Shimshon has brought in, because it's a little bit complicated. What the Zera Shimshon is saying from these meforshim asking from these meforshim is that perhaps the Torah meant to say, if you take the olives and you just press them and you get out the best oil, we get it, that's for the menorah, and the menorah is limited to that grade A oil. And if you wanted to use that grade A oil for the meal offerings, you could also do that. That's kind of step one, you're okay. However, if you want to use the inferior olive oil, then don't press the olives at all. Take the entire olive, and before you extract any oil from it, grind them in the millstones, grind them up completely, in which case you are now guaranteed of having a mixture of all of the oil that was in the olive, meaning the best oil, the grade A oil, and the grade B oil is now all mixed together. And that's what was allowed for menachos, not taking the olives, extracting the best of the olive oil, the grade A olive oil, and then grinding the olives, in which case you're only left with the grade B, the lower level inferior oil. That's the second question on Rashi. How did Rashi know that the menachos, it's okay to use only the grade B oil as opposed to grinding up the olives and extracting both grade A and grade B oil together? That's the second question. So let's move to the next paragraph as the Zera Shimshon begins to answer the questions of the Meforshim, the commentators on Rashi. V'yesh lomar, and we can say, de lefizeh, according to this, meaning according to the approach of these commentators who ask these questions, hoyu bikan shtei svaros hafuchos. We have here two lines of reasoning which contradict each other. The achar shekosav b'menorah. After the Torah wrote regarding the menorah, which is in that first pasuk we looked at, kosis lama, or that the olives should be crushed a little bit for getting out the best oil to light the menorah. Ilo have kosis b'menachos. If the Torah had not written the word crushed regarding the meal offerings, hayisi yochol lomar, I might have said shahakosis yeh posel lemenachos. I might have said that the best oil, the grade A oil, is actually unfit for meal offerings. The Moshe Kosav Rashi al Posuk v'Isar and Soles, as Rashi himself actually suggested that a person might mistakenly think in his commentary on the second pasuk about the Korban Mincha. Ulefi svarazu, according to this line of reasoning, tzarech lomar shehachoshuv, you would have to say that the finest oil, the best oil, dahainu Hashem and Harishon, which is that first grade A olive oil that comes out, puzzle is actually unfit to use for the meal offerings. Umamela, and from this, shelamenochos tzarech hagarua, you would then have to conclude that for the meal offering, since you're not allowed to use the finest oil, the grade A oil, then you need to use the inferior oil, the Hainu Hashem and Hasheni, which is what we call the grade B oil. The in Cain, and if so, if that's where your reasoning has led you, Ein od svara lomar she Hashem and Hasheni yeh posel, then you can no longer say that the grade B oil is also unfit for the menachos, for the meal offering. So in other words, the first thing the Zera Shimshon does is he says, if we think carefully and we analyze the approach that the Meforshim on Rashi are taking, they're actually using kind of contradictory thinking, because on the one hand, they're bringing a svara, they're bringing a lot of reasoning that would lead us to believe that the best oil cannot be used. It's puzzle for the menachos for the meal offerings. It can only be used for the menorah, and it cannot be used for the menachos for the meal offerings. But according to that way of thinking, then of course you'd have to be able to use the grade B oil for the menachos. If you can't use grade A oil, you have to use grade B oil. But once you're in a position where you're using the grade B oil for the menachos, you can't then come in with a second line of reasoning that says, oh yes, and the grade B oil is also unfit for the menachos. You can't hold those two trains of thought, those two approaches together at the same time, because they, as the Zera Shimshon says, they're hafuchos, they contradict each other, because obviously the Torah is requiring us to use some kind of olive oil for the menachos, for the meal offering. So you can't at the same time say the best oil, grade A oil, cannot be used for menachos, and grade B oil cannot be used for menachos. Then you're left without olive oil for the menachos. The first step the Zera Shimshon takes is to point out that that kind of reasoning is not going to work, it's untenable. Now let's continue. V'im tomar svara acheres, and if you say that there is a different approach, shahasheni posel lemenachos, that the reason the grade B oil is unfit for meal offerings is bishvil she'ein me'urav besocho shemen harishon hameshubach. It's because the grade A oil, the excellent fine oil, is not mixed with it, as the Zera Shimshon brought when he brought in his second question from the portion. In Cain, if so, lemenachos lo ba'inon garua. If so, then that means we are not requiring or limiting ourselves to the inferior oil for the meal offerings. Umikol shkein sheyeh kosher hashemen harishon. And if that's the case, then certainly the grade A oil would be kosher, would be appropriate and fitting to use for the menachos. In other words, if you take the approach that the Torah wants you to grind up the entire olive together, so without taking anything out of it first, to grind up all of the olives together with no previous extraction of oil, so that you get the best of the fine oil, the grade A, and the grade B oil all together coming out during the grinding process. If that's what your approach is, as it was for the second question in the Meforshim that the Zera Shimshon brought down, if that's your approach, that means that of course you can use grade A oil by itself. Once you allow for a mixture of grade B oil and grade A oil, then grade A oil by itself is even better. Kol shkein, kal v'chomer, it's going to work for you in the meal offerings. And therefore, once you're at that point in your reasoning, then the Torah did not need to use the word kosis at all when it was talking about the korban menachos, the menachos, the meal offerings. V'leka lemeimar dibo'inan dafka kosis, and we shouldn't say that there's a requirement to use only the finest oil. Shaharei b'menorah kosiv lama or, because regarding the menorah, it's written the word for illumination, the mashma velo lemenachos, which implies that the finest oil is a limitation only if you're dealing with the menorah, but you're not restricted to the finest oil if you're dealing with the menachos, with the meal offerings. Elavadai tzarech lomar, but we would have to say shahakosuf bo lahachshir hakosis, that the pasuk regarding the meal offerings, when it uses the word kosis, is not coming to require it, but rather coming to teach us that it is permissible to use in the meal offerings. La'afuke hasvara shehayolonu, to exclude, to push away and exclude the line of reasoning that we had, shahakosis yeh apostle, that the finest oil is unfit for the meal offerings. Ukesheyesh svara zu ba'olam, once that svara is in the world, meaning that's the svara that becomes operative that we're working with, al korchach tzarech lomar hasheni kosher lemenachos, we are forced to admit that the inferior oil, the grade B oil, is kosher, is fit to be used in the meal offerings. Umemela, and from this, im ita hasvara ha'acheres, now you're able to knock out the other line of reasoning, lomar shahagaru apostle, which wanted to say and wanted to argue that the inferior oil is unfit for the meal offerings. The Hainu Hasheni, which is what we call the grade B olive oil. The ilo havekosov lo kosis b'menachos velo lama or b'menorah. And let's say, going back to answer the first question that the Zera Shimshon brought in on Rashi, that the Torah should have just left out both words, leave out the word lama or by the menorah, leave out the word kosis by the menachos, and everything will be fine and everyone will be happy and there'll be no problems. If the Torah actually did that, hayisi omer b'mikol shkein, then I would logically think that there is a kal v'chomer here, she'af b'menachos ba'inon kosis tafka, that even with the meal offerings, we require only the finest grade A oil, just as we do by the menorah. That is a thought process, if the Torah left out its extra words in both places, that might become very attractive. Kidisnan beperek ches menachos, as the Mishnah actually teaches in the 8th parak of Maseches Menachos, Uma im ha-menorah she'eno la'achilo to unashem and zayis zach. If the olive oil we use to the menorah, which is not consumed by any person, no one drinks the olive oil that is used to light the menorah, if that is required to be the purest level, the purest grade A level olive oil, ha-menocho shehein la'achila, then the meal offerings, which are in fact eaten and are consumed by people, v'chule, etc., that the etc. is lo kol shkein, shouldn't it certainly be true? Now that's a line of reasoning that the Zera Shimshon brings in from the Gemara Masechta Menachos that is ultimately not accepted by the Gemara, but it's what we call a havamin. It's what the Gemara brings in as a possible line of reasoning that ultimately isn't accepted. But the Zera Shimshon says, we would have thought that we easily would have been attracted to that line of reasoning unless we had the Torah words that it put in to show us that that is not the case, that we shouldn't think if the menorah requires the purest oil and no one drinks that oil, no one consumes that oil, then certainly menachos, which people eat and consume, should certainly have the finest oil. We would have been attracted to that, and we would have come up with the wrong halacha. We would have made the wrong deduction, because we would have said that the same way the menorah requires only and is limited to only grade A oil, olive oil, so too that's true with menachos. But that in fact is not the halacha and not what the Torah is trying to teach us. So the Zera Shimshon has come full circle, and he says, now we can understand, now that we've answered and showed how the approaches that were inherent inside of the questions that the Meforshim on Rashi asked on Rashi are not tenable. Now we can come back and see exactly that what Rashi's teaching us, that the Torah needed to write the word lama or for illumination regarding the menorah, and it needed to write the word kosis, which is a reference to crushing the olives as opposed to grinding them up with millstones, in reference to the menachos, the meal offerings. And by having both of those words in place, we make the correct deductions, which is that the menorah is limited to the grade A oil, and we can only use the grade A oil to light the menorah, whereas the menachos, we may use the grade A oil, but we're not limited or restricted to it. We can also use the grade B oil, and even by itself, without any of the finer oil mixed in with it. So by completing that circle, we're back to where we started in Rashi, where Rashi helped us understand the correct halacha regarding the lighting of the menorah oil and also the oil used for the menachos, for the meal offerings. Yasher koach for everyone for participating, and we wish everyone a freilich in Purim, that God willing should be a wonderful simcha and a joyous occasion for all of Klal Yisrael. And we look forward, God willing, to learning together in the Zera Shimshon next week.